For my second painting of my autumn series, I paint an idyllic scene of two chairs overlooking a beautiful lake surrounded with fall trees. This one took about 2.5 hours to complete, and that included the sketching time. I'm using Baohong Academy rough 100% cotton 300 GSM watercolor paper, and this is a 15-inch by 10.2-inch block. If you like the style of this watercolor, you should definitely check out my last video for a bit more kind of about my inspiration for it, and I'll link that at the end screen. So I did start by sketching out the deck and the bank lightly with a mechanical pencil, and then I draw in the chairs, and I'm using a reference photo for this so that I can achieve proper perspective, or at least close enough to it to give the impression of the type of chair it is, which I can never pronounce right. It starts with an A, and I can't pronounce it. I did try to make the two chairs proportional to each other as well. And really, this sketch right here is the hardest part of the painting. Once I had those chairs in, the rest was just laying down color pretty much, and it was really relaxing and fun. Even painting in the chairs after was very easy because I had such a firm framework here for where to lay in my shadows and highlights. It made it really easy. So getting a nice solid sketch first was kind of the most important part of this painting. And again, it was the most challenging part. And it really, for any like single part of this painting, this is what took the longest, was really sketching out these chairs. Now, I didn't sketch out any of the background or of like the lake because I wanted to keep all of that really loose and spontaneous and just make sure that I kind of went with the flow of whatever the watercolor really wanted to do for those areas. So just getting in that solid sketch for the deck and the chairs was my goal. Once I got that in, I wet the entire page with clean water. I used a spray bottle and a really large flat wash brush, and I really made sure that the page was really soaked, and I let it sit for a second to make sure the water seeped into the page. Then I just put a really light wash of gray to kind of knock back the white of the page a bit. You're not even going to see that gray because this is all going to be covered with trees. And then I streak in just a little bit of a like land mixture with some burnt sienna, burnt umber, and whatever gray was in my palette, just to give my separation to where above that's going to be trees, below that's going to be reflections. So then I start with my lightest color with my lemon yellow here, and I start by dabbing in those colors with yellows and then moving toward oranges. And in the top, I'm dabbing it in to create the impression of those fall leaves. Again, it's all wet, so it's going to blend out, but it's still more like dabby and splotchy. And then below that land line where there's a reflection, I'm more streaking in that paint in kind of a downward direction, but with some small horizontal brush strokes to look like some movement in the water. And I leave just a little bit of lighter, like almost white, between the reflection and the bank, because that's going to be a darker shadowy color of green. And I don't want to layer those greens over the yellows and oranges. I want them to be a little bit fresher. So by leaving that white in, it keeps that green just a little bit kind of like a fresher color. Once I get those initial washes in, I did wait for it to dry completely. And then I paint in some dark, like greenish gray shadows. And this is wet on dry for the tree area. And then I spray the water area and drop in that same color in the water. But since I sprayed it, it makes it bleed out and again gives it that sense of reflection. Whereas the top, where it's wet on dry, it has nice like hard edges to look like the kind of shadows between the leaves on the trees. After getting those shadows in and letting it dry, I build up another layer of my colors just to give it, a more intense fall vibe. I basically just to continue to work in layers, and I'm using a flat brush here to create really geometric marks and to give it like that modern impressionistic style, which I feel like is a little bit less common in watercolor. You see it in oils and acrylics with a lot of like palette knife painting and impasto painting, but I wanted to give that same impression with watercolor. So I'm just keeping my brush marks really geometric. I add just the impression of tree trunks here, and I actually put on the color a little bit too intensely first, so then I dabbed it away to keep them really light. Again, I just want to give the impression of tree trunks and then some branches in there, but I don't want them to be really like popping out and be super noticeable. A bit of splatter is always necessary in my paintings. I love splattering. It helps me stay loose and kind of release some perfectionism, and it's just fun to do. So then I just add a little bit more intensity again into the reflections. So I want those kind of the intensity of those colors to closely, not exactly, but closely match the tree colors above them. For the right side, I have a foreground tree there. So that's why I left that area blank for the background, because I knew it was all going to be covered with the foreground tree. And this tree is going to be a more intense color with darker values, but really like the same colors as the background tree. It's just a little bit darker values and more intense color. It's not quite as muted. And that contrast between the really dark values in the front and the kind of lighter values and a little bit more muted colors in the back really gives that sense of depth to this painting, and that's utilizing atmospheric perspective theories. So I use the same techniques for that tree as I did before. I just use a little bit closer to pure colors instead of making them as muted, and there's less water. While that dries, I work on the background a little bit more. And then I start on the deck, and I use a nice strong mix to paint in the wood tones and for the posts on the deck. And I just get that in, and I'm really at this point just like coloring in what I had drawn, because watercolor is transparent. You can still kind of see that drawing under the paint. And after I get that kind of wash of color in, I add a reflection under it. So I kind of just touch the wet paint that I had put in and then drop in a little bit more color to that wet area. And that makes it kind of bleed out and look like a soft reflection. And then basically I just continue to build more and more layers and increase the intensity and the depth. For the water, I'm trying to keep it nice and loose by painting it in wet and wet. So I spray it down with a spray bottle. Sometimes I tilt the page to let the water and paint run down the page a little bit to make it look a little bit more streaky. And that just helps keep that illusion of the reflection in the water. And again, it keeps that distinction between what's reflection and what is the actual trees. But for the trees, I keep it all like as the layers, I keep them wet on dry to make sure that they're crisp and that they don't blend too much. This also helps keep the kind of cooler colors from mixing with the warmer colors, and it keeps it from turning like brown, basically. So for that front tree, again, just adding more color there with the oranges and the yellows, and then adding some nice dark green where underneath the leaves haven't quite changed yet. And then I can add some splatters of those colors into that tree as well to just get some nice texture. Finally, I finished the painting by painting in the chairs. So I did both chairs in the same manner. The left one is kind of half done already here, but it's the same thing. I just did a wash of the color over the entire chair first. And then I add layers to build up the darks. So I leave any of the highlight areas, I leave them that initial like just wash color. There are sometimes when I lift just a little bit, but for the most part, those highlights are just that first wash without any other layers on it. And then I just add more and more layers in the darker areas to create that sensation of, or that impression of 3 dimensions. I try not to be too fiddly with this, but it definitely takes some time to build up the darkness that I was going for. And these layers, it's kind of best if you do them like wet or damp on dry so that you're not just moving around the paint. You actually want to layer the paint to build up that depth. So it just takes some time. You can use a heat tool or a hairdryer or something if you want to go faster, but I just kind of worked back and forth between the 2 chairs. And since I'm not using a ton of water here, that dries really quickly, and it's pretty warm where I live, so it dries quickly. And going back and forth meant that I didn't have to use a heat tool or anything. I add a last layer of leaves to that foreground tree just to make sure that it had the most vivid, high intensity colors and the darkest values to really force it into the foreground and make it have that distinction between the background yellow tree and that this foreground tree is like yellows and oranges as well. Making it more vivid colors and a darker value helps bring that forward. Then when the chairs were completely dry, I did add some of the most minor details, like the lines between the planks of wood, that if you tried to do that when it was even a little bit damp, it would just bleed out and not have those distinct lines. So I wanted to give it even more time before I did that. Finally, I spray down the water and add in the general chair shapes in the water to create the reflection of those chairs. And I think that this step kind of elevated the painting for me. I really liked how this chair reflections looked, and spraying the page first really helped to make it look like a reflection. And so I was really happy with how that turned out. I did decide I wanted that background just a little bit lighter. I didn't feel like the yellow tree was light enough, so I sprayed it down, let it sit for a few seconds, then dabbed it with a towel. So this not only made it lighter, but it created a little bit more texture because I use a kitchen towel that has some texture. So I actually really liked how that added some variety. And that's all. I absolutely love this painting, and I think this might be my favorite painting to date. I love lakes and I love fall, so this is really just an ideal scene for me. Thank you so much for watching. Have an awesome day.